All right, welcome to the podcast. I'm very excited to have Dr. Bart Ehrman on. It's been a long time. I've been a fan of your work, but first time on the podcast. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So you've got an interesting and I think very timely book. Especially in terms of what's going on today. We find in society and in especially politics, which seems to be very heavily married to religion these days, especially on the right. And so your new book, Love Thy Stranger, one of the things that you point out is you talk about this idea, this phrase, I guess, that's been floating around lately, especially in certain Christian circles, this phrase, toxic empathy. This idea that somehow caring too much or caring for maybe the wrong people can actually be a problem. That empathy, if misdirected, can weaken a society, or that compassion has limits. So what is it that, what would be your response to that, and what ultimately drove you to write this book?
The subtitle of the book is How the Teachings of Jesus Transformed the Moral Conscience of the West. And the argument in the book is that, well, that's what the argument is. The basic argument of the book is that before Jesus, there certainly was the sense that you ought to help other people. You know, it's in our DNA. We wouldn't survive as a species if we didn't help each other. It was in Greek and Roman moral philosophy at the time of Jesus. It was in Jewish teachings. So everybody agreed you need to help others. But what I argue in my book is that the distinctive thing about Jesus' teaching is that he stressed that within his tradition, when it says love your neighbor as yourself, for Jesus, your neighbor didn't mean just the guy who lives next door, the woman up the street, and it didn't just mean a person who was socially or biologically related to you or in your same community, and it was actually anybody in need. That's who your neighbor is. And Jesus taught that you need to help those who were in need, regardless of their connection to you. I think fears of toxic empathy somewhat run counter to that view.
Would say. Yeah, so talk a little bit about that, because I think that's something that I know that on this podcast specifically, because we're very interested in the original languages of the Bible, the original Hebrew and Greek, and really taking the text seriously. That is a piece of pushback we get quite frequently, is that those who take a more progressive view, for lack of a better term, aren't taking the Bible seriously. But when we point back to the original words, how do we derive that understanding out of the original languages?
Well, in this case, it's not. Look, I'm a Greek scholar. This is my primary research language, and in graduate school, of course, I had to learn Hebrew and Latin and Coptic. I mean, I learned a bunch of ancient languages, and so I am a big fan on ancient languages and have taught them for many, especially Greek, for 40 years. So I'm big on that. But I'm just saying, you could just read the English Bible and see that it is unambiguous what the teachings of the English Bible are. The big problem with Jesus is knowing what actually he said. So this is a problem scholars have, because there are clearly sayings of Jesus that are put on his lips by later followers. And the task of scholarship, one of the tasks, is to differentiate between the things his followers made him say and the things he actually did say. But once you get back to the things he actually said, it is clear as day that what he thinks that the important thing for people in his generation to do is to get right with God, because the day of judgment was coming very soon. If they're not with God, they're going to be destroyed. Whereas people who are right with God are going to enter into God's kingdom. And he says what that entails. It entails helping people in need. It's not believing in him. It's not having the right theology. It's not even being Jewish. It's helping people in need. You find this repeatedly throughout the Gospels. And so I'm not championing that in the sense that I'm a Christian and, I'm a Christian apologist saying that Jesus got it right. I'm a historian who's not a Christian. I am saying that's what Jesus said. So if anybody wants to, say that people who say that are not following the Bible closely because they don't read Greek or something, what? No, it's just insane. No, of course that's what the Bible says.
Yeah, I like to tell people who kind of push back on that. I said, and he didn't follow with a list of conditions after he said, love your neighbor,
No, the only question is, who is your neighbor? So because there is that episode. It's in the gospel, only in the Gospel of Luke, but because the Hebrew Bible says, Leviticus 19:18 says, you should love your neighbor as yourself. When you read it in Leviticus, there, of course, people don't even read these passages; they just quote them. But if you actually read the very same verse, it indicates who the neighbor is for Leviticus, which is those among your people. And so Leviticus is indicating that you need to love fellow Israelites. And by love, it doesn't mean like to have a feeling or an emotion. It means how you treat somebody. And you have to treat fellow Israelites, even if they're strangers, even if you don't know them, the way you would treat yourself, which means, if you're hungry, you feed yourself. And if you don't have shelter, you find shelter. And if you provide for yourself for what you need. And so if there's another Israelite who doesn't have that, you need to provide for them. So that's Leviticus. But Jesus tells this thing in Luke, and a teacher of the law says, "What's the top law? Love your neighbor as yourself." And the guy wants to justify himself, and so that's what the text actually says. So he said, "Well, who's my neighbor?" Yeah, hoping it's the guy next door. And then Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, where it turns out that the hated enemy is your neighbor. And you need to take care of even your hated enemy who's the other and different from you in your religion, your nationality, your ethnicity. That's the person you take care of if they're in need.
Yeah, and it's funny because obviously that's not the first time that sort of message is conveyed within Scripture. We can go back to the story of Jonah and the whale, and Jonah going to the Assyrians, and their most hated enemy, who were historically speaking were just awful to his people, just brutal. And so like this is not the first time this sort of message comes up, right, in the text.
Well, Jonah does it reluctantly.
Right.
Mary, he jumps on a ship to go the other direction, and God makes him do it. But that's the point. God makes him do it because God is interested in the Assyrians as well as the Israelites, and it's an offensive message to many people. But we live in a world now where the other, the one who's not of our religion or of our race or ethnicity or nationality or whatever, the other is a threat, and we want to destroy them or at least get rid of them. And okay. If that's your policy, okay, that's your policy. But don't tell me it's in the Bible. Don't quote the Bible for that one, because you're actually precisely against the Bible on that one.
Yeah. So what Jesus is really saying there, he's introducing something that's generally kind of new in that way. Is he's not just preaching kindness or generosity, but a kind of moral obligation, as you say, to love people you don't even know. So how is that different from what we see in like Greek and Roman moral philosophy of the time?
So, most people are not particularly interested in Greek and Roman moral philosophy, and I get that.
We are here.
But I am. And I'll tell you, it's really interesting stuff, because so I teach in the South, North Carolina, and my students from the South, they basically generally think that morality came into the world with Christianity, and that the ancient pagans were pagan. They were like unruly, immoral, louts. And so it's not true. Greek and people within the Roman Empire, where Jesus was, which had been highly influenced by the Greek culture, there was a lot of discussion about morality and what it means to be an ethical person, and all of that. And we actually have serious moral, ethical discourses going back to Plato and Aristotle and on, so hundreds of years before Jesus. And they were very concerned about morality, and they're very concerned about helping other people. But the other people you were to help were those who were biologically or socially connected to you. And when you read ancient moral philosophers, they say a lot of things. Aristotle devotes 2 entire books of his Nicomachean Ethics to friendship and what it means to be a friend. And what he says is just compelling, and it's stuff people really ought to read today. But the idea is that you help those close to you, and this is in our DNA. This much is in our DNA. If the human race didn't have this tendency to help others, to cooperate, if that wasn't in us, we wouldn't have survived as a species. Because if it's every person for themselves, you're easily picked off by predators. Even Darwin recognized this. Survival of the fittest does not mean that everybody's out for themselves. It's the group that has to be fit. And so that's in us. But the Greek and Roman moral philosophers picked up on that and made it into kind of a philosophically sophisticated system. But what they didn't have was that you're supposed to help other people outside your group. So that's what Jesus introduces, is that it's not just in-group stuff, not just your family, friends, and community. It's anybody who has needs.
So in your research, how was this seen at the time? The first audience hearing this message, would that have been seen, I would assume, as radical or even sort of unrealistic at the time?
Well, it was unrealistic, and most people realized it was unrealistic. And Jesus expresses it to an extreme. So this is kind of a complicated thing. We don't need to get into the weeds. My book doesn't get deeply into the weeds, but I do explain that within Judaism, there were lots of different Jewish teachers and very, very fine moral teachers within Judaism, and they each had their various takes on things. So it's not that like there was Jewish thinking and then there was Jesus. There lots of Jewish things, and he was part of that. Within his understanding of Judaism, his view is that of many others, that the world was a corrupt place, an evil place, and that God was ultimately sovereign. The creator of the world was ultimately in control of the world, but the forces of evil were wreaking havoc here. God is soon going to intervene and destroy these powers of evil and set up a good kingdom on earth. Jesus thought that was going to happen. He called it the kingdom of God. He talked about the coming kingdom of God. People need to be ready for it so they can enter into this new paradise that was soon to come. Jesus thought it was going to happen soon. He thought it would be within his generation. He thought some of his disciples would not die before they saw it happen. Because he was so sure this day of judgment was coming soon, it radicalized his ethics. Because you have to behave the way God wants you to get into this kingdom. And since it's coming soon, there's no time for half measures. You have to go all out. And so Jesus says things that he means. If you're rich, you need to sell everything you have and give to the poor. Then you can get into the kingdom. Whoa, what? And he praises his disciples because they've left everything. They've left their families, their spouses, their children, their homes, their jobs to follow Jesus. And Jesus praises them for it. And when people today, ardent Christians today, read that, they think, well, that's really noble. They gave up everything. They really devoted, those disciples. But what they're not thinking about is the people they've left behind. Because as the sole leaders of their households, these men would have been the breadwinners. And if the breadwinner leaves, how do you get food? Well, you either do very nasty things to survive or you don't survive. So it's radical. You asked if it's radical. Yeah, it's very, very radical. But it's because of Jesus' apocalyptic views that the judgment was coming soon.
Man, that's fascinating. I've not heard that connection made before, and it makes a lot of sense. These people who believed in their time and age that the end was coming, that they would act, accordingly. And I think that's one of the things that I'm sure you see in, being a teacher as well. A lot of people think they read these texts, these ancient texts today, and they apply that same logic to today when it was meant for a specific people at a specific time.
Well, one of the kind of unfortunate ways that people have applied that teaching to their own situation today is that there are many evangelical Christians who still think Jesus is coming back soon. And this has seriously affected their concern for climate change, for example, and the environment. Because if Jesus is coming back in a year or two, what's it matter if we devastate the world we live in? It's not going to matter. It's going to end soon anyway. and so there's been a lot of polling on this, among outside polls polling evangelicals about their concern about climate change and whether we should do anything about it. And a lot of just kind of regular old folk who are evangelicals say, well, there's no reason to do anything about it. The world's not going to be around much longer.
Yeah, and that kind of overlaps a little bit with what I've heard referred to as escape theology, where we don't really need to worry about the here and now because it's all going to go away. And ultimately, the end goal is to get into heaven, over there, and so who cares about what happens to the earth and, the people in it?
Yeah, well, it's been a kind of a public issue since the Reagan administration when the Secretary of the Interior was James Watt, and he was an evangelical Christian who believed Jesus was coming back soon. And in a congressional hearing, a Democratic senator asked him if he thought that we needed to preserve our resources for future generations. And he said he wasn't sure how many future generations there would be until Jesus came back. Whoa! Normally that's not the kind of thing you hear in a congressional hearing, at least back then. And it got really people upset. Like the Secretary of the Interior is supposed to be protecting our resources, our natural resources. And he's saying he's not sure you need to. Oh! Yeah, that set off a fire.
Yeah. And that's quite a change from the Republicans of old, like the Eisenhower era Republicans, were all about conservation and national parks and things of that nature. So I'm sure that probably confusing people.
It confused people, and he kind of tried to walk it back, but it was clear he really did think Jesus was coming soon. And so it affects things. It affects things.
Yeah, absolutely. So at some point, you talk about how, eventually loving even strangers becomes something like a moral common sense in the West. How does this happen, and how do we go from a radical idea to something that shapes entire societies?
So there's kind of two aspects to that. The followers of Jesus after he died, very few of them took him literally and sold everything. Some people did, but most people didn't. And his teachings got softened over time. As people started realizing the end's not coming on Thursday, they started realizing we're going to be here for the long haul, and we need to develop our ethical systems in light of that. And so they had to soften his teachings, which they did. But the core of his teachings remained. The core was that if somebody's in need, we need to help them. The reality is that today, this is what almost everybody in the West feels internally. It's not that everybody acts on it, but people have this sense, and many people do act on it. So right now, I don't know if you can see, I'm in my mountain house. My mountain house is outside of Asheville, North Carolina. And I was here in this house when Hurricane Helene hit, and it was very nasty. I didn't suffer any damage, but I was stuck here for a long time. And it was really interesting to see the relief efforts. People around the country were sending in money. People in local communities were bringing water in by mule, because people didn't have anything. And all this money that was coming in, these people who were helping out, just dozens, hundreds of volunteers, they didn't know the people they were helping. And they probably will never know these people that they were helping. And if they did know them, they probably wouldn't like them. But they helped anyway. Well, what is that? That is written into us now. That's just what we feel. And so when we hear about a disaster someplace overseas or at home, we feel like we need to send a check, so you send a check to Doctors Without Borders or to some care or to some place like that. People volunteer at a soup kitchen, or people volunteer for... Where does that come from? It does not come from the Greek and Roman worlds that Christianity emerged out of. It comes from the teachings of Jesus. And so I try to establish this historically. In other words, I'm not doing this as a person of faith. But you can show historically that this line of thinking, this line of moral thinking, was dominant within Christianity, even when they softened Jesus' teachings. You got to help those in need. And so when Christianity took over the Roman Empire, starting in the 4th century in a big way, by the end of the 5th century, basically, they're getting there. Once the Roman Empire, the entire Western world at the time, becomes Christian, people hear this message repeatedly: help those in need. Help those in need. And it changes where people give their money to, and it changes how they understand what it means to be a good person. And that view sticks around century after century after century after century. So that today, even those of us who are atheists have this built into our moral system. And it's because of the fact that Christianity took over the world, and that Christianity took out as the core moral teaching that you need to help people in need, which was not the teaching anywhere else in the Western world before.
That's really interesting. I did an interview a couple months back with Dr. John Dominic Crossan, and he just released a new book on sort of religion that aligned with empire. And
yes.
So you're talking about when it became the state religion. So he kind of goes the opposite direction, where he talks about all the negative side of that.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that stuff in my book too. I mean, look, there's a real dark side, and I don't think Dom would disagree with me on this particular thesis, and I won't disagree with him on the horrible things that resulted. The thing is, in our bifurcated age, where everybody is just taking one side or the other, it has become impossible for the two sides to talk to each other. Not just in politics, but in religion, involving social agendas. You've got an opinion. The other person is evil and demonic, and so the other is always castigated rather than listened to. And so in this book, unlike my other books often challenge traditional Christian beliefs in one way or another, but in this book, I thought, there really is some good that came out of Christianity. And even though Christianity was responsible for pogroms against Jews that led to slaughters of entire villages, leading to the Holocaust, and crusades against Muslims, leading to Islamophobia and hatred of Muslims now, and inquisitions where you torture people to death because they don't share just exactly your belief. You get all of these things. You get justifications for slavery, justifications for war, still today. on Christian grounds. And, so it has a very dark sides to it, but it also has good sides to it. And so I think we're remiss if we don't look at both. So in my book, I try to show that historically, Christians in the West are the ones who invented public hospitals. They invented orphanages. They invented old people's homes. They invented poor houses. They invented private charities dealing with hunger and homelessness. They invented governmental assistance to the needy. In the West, these are Christian inventions. And again, I'm just saying historically, but as a person who's interested also in ethics and morality, I think, well, that's good. I'm glad. I'm glad we have those things.
Well, and it goes back to what you just said, where nothing is all good or all bad. Too often we leave out the nuance, and we try to, as you said, divide things into black and white, good and evil. And when we do that, we sort of simplify it to a degree it was never meant to be simplified to. We call it dualism or dualistic thinking, and
right.
Where does that get us? Kind of where we are today. We see it in politics, we see it in religion. And again, it kind of goes back to one of my favorite authors, Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book about tribalism and the dangers of tribalism, where it becomes a situation where, sure, you've formed a common bond with like-minded people, but as a result, you've created an outsider or an outside group. And so it's this in or out kind of,
Yeah. Well, I think that's the normal human tendency, and it's precisely because of evolutionary biology. We've biologically developed that kind of genetic structure where we try to protect the group, and that means warding off the enemy, even if they are fellow humans. But tribalism recurs regularly, and it often leads to very bad things, as we're seeing right now, just every day in the news.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that stood out to me is this idea wasn't just accepted. It was debated, it was misunderstood, and even resisted by early Christians. Talk about that a little bit. Sorry, as you take
No, it's fine. It's all right, so I'll give you a good example of what happens is Christians, they agree, of course, that Jesus' teachings are, that's how we're supposed to live our lives. But they realize it's impracticable, really. For one thing, when Jesus was teaching, he was teaching in a very remote rural area in an outback region of the Roman Empire. He didn't have these many, many thousands of followers as he's portrayed, in the Bible or in Hollywood movies. He had some followers, but they were lower class peasants, basically, day laborers from this region in Galilee. Within 100 years, 150 years, you've got Christian churches spread throughout the Mediterranean. You've got them not just in Judea and in Galilee, but up in Syria and Cilicia and Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey. We're in Greece now, over in Italy, maybe as far as away Spain, North Africa. In urban areas, you've got all these things, and they're not living in the context that this rural preacher in Galilee was living in, with a small group of followers. They're becoming an institution, and so naturally, they confront different ethical dilemmas, different moral decisions, different issues. And so the teachings have to be adapted to the new situation. But they also have to be adapted because his teachings are all really premised on the idea that this kingdom of God is coming very soon. And if it's not coming soon, how do you live? And so one really interesting example of how the teachings get shifted is an example I use in my book is a church father named Clement of Alexandria. So he lives in Alexandria, Egypt. He's writing around the year 200. And we have a number of his writings. He's an ethical thinkers, talk about ethics and morality and such. So he wrote a book it's a treatise called What Rich Man Will Be Saved? And it's based on this passage in the Gospels where this man comes up to Jesus, filthy rich, and says, what must I do to have eternal life? And Jesus tells him that he has to sell everything and give to the poor. And the man walks away completely upset because there's no way he can do that. He just can't bring himself to do it. And that's when the disciples asked Jesus, well, what? A rich guy can't get in? Why not? It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to get into the kingdom of heaven. Whoa, okay. Well, I think Jesus meant it. In fact, I think you can show Jesus really did mean it. You have to give away everything. In the year 200 in Alexandria, Egypt, Clement has this sermon. He's got a big church, and he's got like rich people in this church. And so he writes this treatise, and in the treatise he says, look, this passage says you should sell everything and give to the poor. Jesus did not mean it. He does not want you to sell everything. If you sell everything, you'll be poor. Then somebody's going to have to support you. And if you sell everything, who's going to give money to the church? So like he goes on and he says that it means just the opposite of what it says. But, in that situation, it makes sense that he would say that. But so he definitely agreed that if you've got any additional wealth, any excess wealth, you should give it to those in need. He would agree with that, but he had to soften the teachings. And so that's what happens then. And so throughout history today, I mean, I know thousands of Christians over my lifetime, and I maybe have met 2 or 3 that have actually taken Jesus' teachings literally.
Yeah, there was an interesting book that came out some years back. I think it was called A Year of Living Biblically, I believe, and where it's just darn near impossible to...
Well, so this guy, Filer was his name, he wanted to implement the Jewish law literally.
Yeah.
For a year. Harder. My God. Yeah, it is a very funny book. But he was seriously doing it, but he meant it to be a funny book. But so what would it take actually to keep the Jewish law? Wow.
I mean, yeah. Good luck. And he makes a good point. It's next to impossible to try to do it. So in that sense, we are constantly over time negotiating with the text and kind of wrestling with it and kind of deciding like what applies and what doesn't in the modern age. Because as you said, again, many of the authors thought that the world was going to end thousands of years ago. And so we're still here somehow. So talk a little bit about, and you kind of mentioned this briefly, the parallels between kind of the resistance back then in the early Christians and what we're seeing today, because there's, a lot of examples. I know, if you just jump online, especially recently, there are the actions of the current administration, and then, they're tweeting out about how great God is. And you're like, these two things don't jive,
So it has long been easy to weaponize the teachings of Jesus, where he'll say something and people will use it to advance their own social or political agenda. And a lot of people do it. And it's because, Jesus has authority, or they quote the Bible because the Bible has authority. It's a very strange phenomenon. One reason it's strange is because people quote, they'll cherry pick some verse or other that aligns with their views. But some other verse that's like right next to it, they'll say doesn't apply anymore. And so, I mean, the famous example is the book of Leviticus that says that it's an abomination for a male to lie with a male. And then in the next chapter it says that it's absolutely wrong. You cannot wear a sweater made of 2 fabrics.
Right.
And so you say, well, yeah, that doesn't apply anymore. Or you can't plant 2 different crops in the same field. And, and so all of that's forbidden, but you launch on the one that you happen to agree with and ignore the other 2 and say they don't apply anymore. And you have no criteria for doing it. It's just that you that's what you think. And so you quote the one and ignore the others. Or when people absolutely have never even read the Bible who quote it. When Marjorie Taylor Greene had this thing, I don't know if you remember this a year or so ago, where there was a piece of legislation against anti-Semitism that I think had to do with school admissions. And this thing would not allow schools to discriminate against people for admission into their schools for students because they were Jewish. So it's pretty simple stuff. You shouldn't do that. But Marjorie Taylor Greene said she could not support the legislation. The reason she could not support the legislation was because if she did, it would mean that she could not publicly affirm what the Bible says, which is that the Jews handed Jesus over to Herod to be crucified. Or was it Herod handed Jesus over? Yeah. Herod handed Jesus over to the Jews to be crucified. That's what she said. So Herod was the king of the Jews. So the king of the Jews handed Jesus over to the Jews to be crucified. I'm wondering, what Bible has she been reading lately? So there are 4 accounts of Jesus being put on trial and being condemned to crucifixion. They're Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there's only one of them that mentions Herod. That's Luke. And when Luke mentions Herod, it says that Jesus appeared before Herod, and Herod found no guilt in him. And he turned him back over to Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor. In all 4 Gospels, it's Pontius Pilate who hands Jesus over to his Roman soldiers to crucify. She has her mind that Jews actually crucified Jesus based on the commandment of the Jewish leader. She's either making it up or she's just ignorant. And I don't think she was making it up in the sense that she was trying to be mean toward Jews. I think that she really is just ignorant. But then why is she quoting the Bible for something that's the opposite of what it says?
That seems to happen a lot. One of the things I've been digging into a lot recently, just because, watching what's happening, at least in the United States, has got me interested to understand the history of it. I'm a big history nerd myself, and that's what I went to school for. And so my, reaction to that sort of thing is just to research it, dig into it, and find the root cause of it. And so one of the things I've been researching a lot is sort of evangelicalism and sort of how it intertwined with politics, and then ultimately sort of how evangelicalism itself sort of mutated, I'll say, once it hit the shores of the United States. Part of that seems to be sort of this, I'll say, less of a they put it a lesser importance, I would say, is education and understanding, the actual original intent, how the original audiences would have understood the text. And sure, they'll read it, but it seems like academics are sort of poo-pooed in that environment. And so it does feel like there is a lot of misquoting happening, sort of selective reading, a lot of just misunderstanding or picking verses out without reading the context around it. And that does seem to be a pattern within specifically evangelicalism in the Western world.
Yeah, I mean, you can trace the history of evangelicalism as you've been researching, and it's one of the interesting phenomena is that the fundamentalism really started out in the 19th century, and there were complicated roots to fundamentalism, but the two main things that drove it were opposition, first to science. People before the fundamentalists, basically, they thought the things described in the Bible are what happened in the Bible. But then you start getting, you get Darwin with the origins of the species. And you start getting geologists who realize that this Earth is not 4,000 years old. And the scientists start saying things that seem to be contrary to the book of Genesis, for example. So what do people who basically believe in the Bible do? They become fundamentalists, which means that they double down on the Bible and they start saying it literally means this. And so they're opposing science, but they're also opposing developments in Europe in biblical scholarship, because this is the period when scholars start taking the Bible seriously as a book and start reading it in light of the kind of critical scholarship you would apply to any other book. And suddenly they start finding contradictions, and they find implausibilities, and they realize there's sources behind these things that are older than the documents that we have, and they find there's unhistorical stuff in here, and they start saying this, and the fundamentalists again are being attacked, and so they double down and become fundamentalists. So, but for me, one of the interesting things that's happened over the last 20 or 30 years is that this evangelical belief that the Bible's our root, it's inerrant, and we need to know, and we base our doctrines directly on the Bible. Evangelicalism over the last 20 or 30 years has really shifted away from a doctrinal perspective of where you dig into the Bible and you get the truth that way, and it's become more of a social agenda movement. It's all about identity. To be an evangelical means, that you oppose abortion, and that you in support of guns, and you have these agendas that are not really talked about in the Bible. Even abortion, by the way, is not talked about in the Bible. And so, but to be an evangelical means those things, and it's no longer. So you assume the Bible's true, but you don't even read it because it's not as important to you as it used to be.
Yeah, it's amazing to me. You brought up a great point. It's sort of hitching the wagon to politics. It sort of began, even before the Reagan era, but really started to become more prominent then, and sort of creating what we call one-issue voters, where abortion, whoever the candidate is who supports or who's anti-abortion, essentially, we vote for that candidate. This information is not difficult to come by. You can research the history of this. I had a guest on a couple of years ago who was formerly worked for the Republican Party, and he broke down the history of it, realizing that they weren't going to win an election again. And so how do we increase voters? Well, there's this whole, fundamentalist wing of voters that we could attract by adopting these platforms. And so it's amazing to me in the era of, we're not selling encyclopedias door to door anymore, where we have the internet, and yet.
Right. Yeah. No, I know. Yeah. No. Well, that certainly has changed. That certainly too has changed a lot of things. And there are a lot of political agendas that directly relate, to the evangelical tradition. So I don't know if like the shift in evangelicalism. I don't know if you know this book, Jesus and John Wayne. Do you know this
Yes.
book?
Yes.
Yeah.
Krista
Well,
Jimenez. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Oh my God, it's fantastic, and
It's
it kind of
amazing.
it explains these connections. And for me, as a biblical scholar, as a scholar of the New Testament, what really I find bothersome in these kinds of shifts is that the social agendas that are being promoted often are directly contrary to the teachings of Jesus, and I find that troubling because they're using Jesus to support views that they have, and it'd be better if he actually did support those views. And I mean, just to take immigration as an example, look, I'm not proposing a particular immigration policy at all. Like I'm not taking, but I am saying that if somebody says that they're a Bible believer and they believe in getting rid of all of immigrants because they don't belong here, the Bible's quite clear on this. That in Israel, loving your neighbors yourself, as I said earlier, means fellow Israelites. But in the Bible, it explicitly states that anybody emigrates into Israel, any immigrant is to be treated as an Israelite, the same as the citizens. And so that's the biblical view. So I'm not saying that we should have governmental policies based on biblical views. What I'm saying is that if you say that you're a believer in the Bible and you're trying to follow its teachings, you should follow its teachings instead of like making up your own teachings and then saying the Bible supports it.
Yeah, that you actually kind of jumped into my next question, which is, this sort of resistance that's cropping up again here and now, and I think it's really being tested or strained even because we're confronted with this every day now, where we've got ICE out there who are aggressively trying to remove immigrants from society, and then we've got this new war in Iran, questionable at best, we'll say, and so people are being kind of put to the test. We're like, and if we refer back to what the Bible has to say about these types of things, it feels pretty clear, and yet we see people bending over backwards within Christianity in the United States, finding ways to still defend these things.
Yeah, well, that's the irony for me. I mean, I certainly have strong political opinions and opinions about social agendas like everyone else. But in my book, Love Thy Stranger, and the things we're talking about now, it's not so much about like, I want everybody to agree with me on my personal views. It's that if you really want to know what the teachings of Jesus are, you ought to read what his teachings are. And if you want to invoke his name, you ought to invoke his name for something that he stood for instead of something he stood against. I mean, I think it's quite clear. Jesus said, love your enemies. So I did a podcast a few days ago, actually, with a Ukrainian theologian. He's from Ukraine, and he escaped when the Russians came in. He was in one of those cities where the Russians were taking all the men and making them serve in the Russian army. And so he got out ahead of that, and he's living in Poland now. But he's a Christian theologian. And so I asked him, I said, you're a follower of the Bible. I mean, he's not a fundamentalist or anything, but you're a follower of Jesus, and he says, love your enemies. How do you possibly love the Russians? And he said, yeah. He said, no, I know it's really hard. He said what I said. It doesn't mean I have to like them. It doesn't mean I have to approve of what they're doing. It doesn't mean I should help them do what they're doing at all. Loving them means that I should hope for the best for them. And the best thing for them would be to stop killing innocent people and stop attacking our country. If they would do that, it would be better for them. And I really hope, not just for our sake, but for their sake, they'll stop. And I thought, man, that's hard. That's hard to do, to feel that way about people who are just invading your country.
Yeah, my dad, who is a retired ELC, a Lutheran pastor, and I have a lot of discussions on that very topic. He talks about, this Amish family whose, I think, the son, I believe, was murdered, and their ability to forgive the killer. And I think of even a bigger example, obviously the Holocaust, which you brought up earlier, these Jews who were in concentration camps who somehow find a way to forgive, again, the people who had been torturing and murdering them. And it's impossible for me to conceive of. I think of somebody harming my daughter, and I'm like, there's a limit to my forgiveness.
That's right. Yeah. So again, for me, it's not that I insist people behave a certain way. I have strong feelings about how people ought to behave. I personally think the teachings of Jesus are ones that I try to follow, even though I'm not a Christian. But what really irritates me is people who weaponize his teachings for their own agendas that are precisely contrary to his teachings. And so when you have people praying that we can just completely slaughter the enemy in Jesus' name, what? I would ask, what are you thinking? But you're clearly not thinking.
Right. Well, it's like, who is it? The Democratic candidate from Texas, James Tallarico.
Yeah.
Who had some pastors openly pray for his demise. I'm like, what are we? What?
And you heard his response. He said, "I love
Yeah.
you more than you hate me." I was like, wow, no, he's the real deal.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Agreed. I mean, that's the response that you would hope, you know.
But why does it break down on political lines? I don't.
Right.
Like, it makes no sense. You know, even things like abortion, it makes no sense that it be on political lines. But I mean, because it doesn't. Everybody wants people to live. Everybody wants people to have choice. And historically, abortion was never a Republican issue. It became a Republican issue, and so much so that to be a Republican, you got to have one view. And it's like, why? It's not, and it's not in the Bible, by the way. You know, I think I mentioned, it's like there's no specific reference to abortion in the Bible. There's only 2 passages in the Hebrew Bible that are related at all. Both of them indicate that in the judgment of those who are writing the Jewish law, the fetus is not a human being with human rights. Numbers 5, yeah. Exodus 21, it's clear as day.
Yeah, I mean, you rightly point out the fact that I think the issues have been sort of, for lack of a better term, dumbed down to the point where it takes out all nuance, which is something, again, we talked about earlier, where, I made the point, I was talking to one of my good friends whose family typically votes a certain way, fairly conservative. And I said, if Hitler was running on your ticket, would you vote for them so long as they were pro-life? We take all nuance out of it, and looking in terms of looking at the larger picture, it's like,
no, people don't want nuance, and people don't want expertise. They don't want nuance. They don't want intellectuals. They don't want scholars. They want to go with their gut, and with leaders who go with their gut. And so, okay, I mean, that's where we are. But it's too bad, because it can lead to so much harm in the world. I'm not just talking about, obviously not just talking about expertise in the Bible here. Like, how about like in medicine and science and things like expertise? People lambast like scientists and stuff, but they still use iPhones. Where do they think the iPhones came from? Somebody's gut feeling?
Yeah. Well, and I find that those people always have a line, right? Like, if they were going in for open heart surgery,
exactly.
Do you want the guy who's like, I feel good about this, or the guy who spent, a decade learning how to do that?
Exactly. Yeah. No, I know.
Yeah. And and kind of the other thing I was thinking of too is when we talk about those very complex issues, I think, to your point, I'm not pro-abortion. I'm pro-choice, but because it's a complex issue, I'm not pro-abortion, though. That's very different. I'm for, sex education and readily available contraceptives. So so that way we can avoid putting young women in that dilemma to make an unbelievably difficult choice that I will never understand because I'm a male. And so, there's nuance to these types of discussions that just does not exist in yeah.
It's very there's no neutral territory. There's right and wrong, this side and that side, and people don't listen to the other side. I mean, on the abortion issue, I really listen to people who have different views from mine. I myself have changed my views over the years, and so there aren't very many people who like changing their views. People tend to basically they want to stick with what they whatever they thought when they were 12 is true. Still, when they're 70, what? You should be willing to change your mind if you think about it. Maybe people don't like to think. They like to. I mean, look, a lot of people like to think. Of course, a lot of people, of course, they love to think, and a lot of us like to think. But it is scary how much of the population does not really want to think. They want to be entertained, and life is hard or life is boring, and so it's that way. We need to have people who are intelligent and have expertise who are helping us live our lives, because it's not just that thinking is complicated and nuanced, but life is complicated and nuanced. And you have to have people who know what they're doing for us to get by.
Absolutely. My first reaction is, what does the preponderance of scholarship have to say about this particular topic? The people who have spent lifetimes studying this subject matter, those are the people who I want to lean into and say, what have you found? Not Joe, who did 20 minutes of Google research.
Well, people have kind of these simple arguments against that. Oh yeah, but they're always changing their mind about things, or they used to think this, now they think that. You can't trust anybody. But they certainly trust somebody, because you got to trust somebody. You got to know what to eat. You got to know what to put into your system. And so, yeah, I know. Expertise is on the decline, and it's going to really it's already hurting our culture, I think.
Well, I want to acknowledge what you just said as well. They're constantly changing their mind. Well, yeah, sure. Like, as new information comes to light, we evolve our understanding, right? Like, I'm sure
they're looking at the evidence.
Right.
They're not like whimsically choosing something else. They're looking at the evidence. Oh, okay. And so there really is progress. Of course there's progress. I mean, look at the lives we're living now versus 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300. There's no progress. Of course there's progress. And it comes by science. And, science isn't just chemistry and biology. I mean, science is a way of approaching any subject. And so even like literary studies involves a science. Philosophy involves a science, in the sense that you're looking at evidence and trying to evaluate it in a way that isn't just conforming to what you already think. This is a product of the Enlightenment. Until Isaac Newton first realized that his personal beliefs had no bearing on how an experiment came out. And the way the experiment came out is what is right. Once he put his personal beliefs and ideas and what made sense to him on the shelf, that's when science starts. But, that's what biblical scholars do. Biblical scholars, the ones who are being really smart, put aside what they personally believe, if they want to know what Jesus said, they look to see what Jesus said, instead of just willy-nilly quoting something that fits their agenda.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up. That's always been sort of something that I've struggled with over the years. It's I probably shouldn't say which scholar, this story's about, but I asked a scholar once who's a biblical scholar, right, and considers himself a historian first and foremost. And having gone to university to study history, the first thing they teach you is you follow the evidence wherever it leads you.
Yes.
You don't start with an assumption or a theory or a hypothesis and then look at the evidence. You look at the evidence first, and then you form a conclusion around that. But yet not a lot, but at least some of these biblical scholars are folks who have always had a belief system. And so, I realize that, and asking for someone to go in with no bias is next to impossible. It's just part of human nature. But it always becomes sort of suspect to me. Where does that bleed in when they're doing scholarship?
Well, it's a very, very big problem. My wife is a Shakespeare scholar, and she started out as a medievalist, teaching Chaucer and stuff. And when she would study Chaucer, she didn't have some kind of vested interest in what her understandings of Chaucer were, or she doesn't have a vested interest in what Shakespeare is. She comes in, she reads, and she analyzes it. But when somebody comes to the Bible, they almost invariably come out of a tradition that the Bible is revered in. Be a very different thing. And so, but you can still do it in that kind of scientific, historical way by being willing to go where the evidence leads you. And to be genuinely. And what happens is people claim they are. I have a lot of evangelical apologist friends who like defend Christianity, who say, oh yeah, no, I'm treating this objectively. And it turns out their objective investigation into whatever issue it is turns out to prove that they were right all along, and they were right when they were 12 years old. And now they've proven it objectively. Right. Really? Like every time it just comes out that way. Yeah, that's just the way it is. I was right. Okay, yeah. I'm not convinced you're being, so I personally don't think, look, we all do have biases. The key is to recognize the biases and to be willing to challenge them. Genuinely willing, not just kind of saying you are so you can make a rhetorical point, but generally to change.
Yeah, absolutely. The last question I have for you, because I know we're running short on time here, but if Jesus were speaking into today's conversations, again, like we talked about earlier about immigration, outsiders, and empathy, what do you think he would emphasize and what might surprise people?
So I think the first point to make is that Jesus was not interested in governmental policy, and he was not interested in social agendas that would improve our lives for the long haul. And it's because he didn't think there was going to be a long haul. And so I don't think we can use him for that kind of thing per se. But we can see what kinds of things he ultimately valued. Of course, he thought loving God above all else was primary. and he thought following God's will was primary. He thought that God's will was that you helped people in need. He was closely aligned with the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament, like Isaiah and Amos, who proclaimed against the leaders of the people and the people who were selfish and greedy and who mistreated the poor and who didn't give of their resources to help people in need. And Jesus took that teaching and he ran with it. He very much thought that our concern should be for anybody in need, regardless of who they were. And so when he tells his stories and he tells his parables and he gives his teachings, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, your race is, your religion is, your nation is, anything like that. If somebody's in need, we are obligated to help. And so we can't really form policies on that per se, but we can ask, do we have policies that do the best to help people rather than hurt them? Or are we more concerned about preserving ourselves and our own wealth and our own riches, our own lifestyle, and to hell with everybody else? Whatever it takes for me to advance more, that's what we're going to do. That's what I want to do. And so, okay, if that's your attitude, that's your attitude. Okay, good. But it's not the attitude of the historical Jesus. If that doesn't matter to you, okay, fine, it doesn't matter. If you call yourself a Christian, it should matter to you.
Yeah. Oh, perfect place to end that. Could not agree more. I hope that there is a sea change. I think you mentioned earlier that in times of tragedy, it seems the good comes out. We saw it at 9/11. People banding together who were complete and utter strangers. The hurricanes that have come through. You see it happen then. And it's just a shame that it seems to take this, a large tragedy in order for that to surface. But ultimately, I think people do feel the drive to help one another when rubber meets the road.
Yeah, I agree. And so, I've got a pretty simple thesis in my book that historically you can trace it all back to the teachings of Jesus. And I don't say it's because it couldn't have come in some other way, but that's historically how it came into our conscience in the West.
Love it. Well, thank you so much. Before I let you go, where can people go to stay up on top of what you're up to and get a copy of the new book?
The new book you can get anywhere, online or at a decent bookstore. In terms of my stuff, if they just Google me, Bart Ehrman, I'm especially keen for people to know about my blog, the Bart Ehrman blog. People have to pay a small membership fee to join. I post 5-6 times a week, every week for 14 years now. I respond to comments I get, answer every question I get, all about the New Testament, historical Jesus. The small membership fee, I don't get a dime. We take no overhead out. We give all the money to charity. We've raised over $3 million, and it's all gone to charities dealing with hunger and homelessness. So the Bart Ehrman blog is something I'd like people to know about.
That's amazing. I will make sure that is in the show notes. So if you're listening, you can go there to click on the link and become a member. And that's incredible. Thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure talking with you.
A pleasure. Thank you. Thanks so much.